Our final speaker for the day is another professor from College of the Canyons, David Andrus. He's the chair of the Department of Political Science. He'll be talking about the difficulties of negotiating in a hyper-individualized world. David?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here today. What I want to talk about is the concept of individualism in this country and the emphasis that's placed on individualism in this country and the consequences that is having for our society in terms of working together in a democratic country. Individualism itself is a cornerstone of American political culture. There's no doubt about that. And without an emphasis on individualism, I think we can all agree we wouldn't have the robust, very highly developed country that we have. It is also so smart to not waste resources in a country. Obviously, individualism allows for us to essentially unleash all of the ideas, political, economic, social, among everybody, so that we can obviously grow exponentially. There's so much here in this country to offer, and so many people have so much to offer. That's really what we think of when we think of the American dream. And we don't really want to leave it to the elites to tell us all of their great ideas, because some of the best ideas come from all sectors of society. However, I think what's happening in this country is that there's a difficult challenge because individualism and its intended goals is kind of morphed into a sense of self-entitlement. And people talk about a lack of work ethic and the idea that people want to know what's in it for me. What is in it for, how am I going to gain materialistically or otherwise? And this is very troubling because it's at odds with the notion, actually, of political culture, which is the idea of having shared values. In a society, in any country, the more values you share, the more stable your country is. And there's a question being raised in this country, not necessarily by me, but many prominent columnists and social scientists, that is this country governable in the way it used to be? It's so large, there's so many subcultures, there are so many different ideas that it's very difficult for us to kind of coalesce around common goals in spite of our differences. So it's a very fascinating time, but also troubling. So what's the evidence for this? Well, the country is filled with ideology, but it's now becoming filled with a lot of ideologues, people that think the highest value is never to back down from your position. If we look at the institution of Congress, it's incredibly polarized by people that have different ideas, essentially, and they're not willing to back down no matter what. And the role of government is actually to govern and find ways to find and define the public interest. Okay, so we have that going on, the eradication of the middle class. We have essentially disparity of wealth, Wall Street elites, the working class struggling, and so forth. If we look at the Affordable Health Care Act, it's very controversial for many people, whether it's the best law to achieve that goal or not. It's another story for another time. The question is, does this country value the idea that everyone should have health insurance? And are they willing to move forward to achieve that, even if they don't like the Affordable Health Care Act? That's the question before us, because you see a lot of people with individual needs somehow or another get wrapped up in, well, how much do I have to give up for the greater good? What other evidence of this is the idea that in any well-defined democratic country, there's something called civil society. A lot of different groups that people can join to participate in to help shape their society, and where they can go with like-minded people. And this is not necessarily, we're not talking about government, we're talking about anything from a bowling league to an environmental activist organization. And what's so fascinating about it is, in our country, we have the most well-rounded, well-developed civil society, more groups you can join than you'll ever know. And yet, many of us in the world of academics and teaching, what we hear all the time is, and you see it in society, people are apathetic and they feel they have no voice. Where do I go to make a difference? How can I change the system? And we see that with no civic involvement or lower civic involvement, very low voter turnout, something's going on here. Well, there's many things going on, not just one. And what I want to talk about now is the idea that we live in a system of systems, okay, that govern us in the world, religious, cultural, economic, political. And anytime you're in a system that essentially defines how a society should live, it conditions you to behave a certain way. So it's really interesting because systems that we live under, capitalism, democracy, and so forth, they come from individuals, individual ideas that then are translated into systems that govern individuals. And then do we really practice the extent of our individualism within those systems? Does the system govern us, or do we govern the system? And when we look at our two primary governing systems, liberal democracy and capitalism, okay, they both emphasize heavily the individual, rightly so. But there's a consequence to that. And we're not here to debate whether or not, at least not today, whether or not we actually have a full-fledged democracy or capitalism, right? Many people would challenge that. What I'm here to say that to some degree, we have democratic processes at work in the United States, and we have market economics and principles at play. Those principles and those values clearly emphasize individualism. Many people think that they are one and the same, right? And this is pretty much part of what we call classical liberalism. Individual economic freedom, individual political freedom and choice. And that is true. They're very compatible in many ways. Okay, so if we look at that politically, we have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, obviously freedom of participation. And then in capitalism, we have freedom of ownership, upward mobility, the innovative ideas that can come from anyone, entrepreneurship, and so forth. So they both emphasize the individual. In liberal democracy, essentially, that emphasizes liberty, more so than social democracy, that places some degree of equality there. In a liberal democracy, the idea of individualism is really centered around the wealth of ideas that exist and how we throw them into the hopper to define the public interest. Yes, there's winners and losers in a democracy. There's not really supposed to be if you buy into the notion of democracy and the idea of having some degree of common good for everybody, even though you disagree. So there are winners and losers, but it's different. We're supposed to be defining the public interest. In capitalism, it's very harsh. There are winners and losers, and that is actually part of the system. Capitalism, in order to thrive, needs that intense competition, which many of us enjoy in many ways, sports and otherwise in society. But capitalism is brutal, right? Time is money. What private equity does for the better or for the worse to various companies in terms of buying them and breaking them up and so forth, the bottom line is money. And if you can't make money, then all the other values that flow from that somehow or another get swept aside. The competition you see even in pop culture, Donald Trump's former show where he gets to tell people you're fired, or all the reality shows where there's always a winner or loser and someone doesn't have good enough talent to be up there. So I think that we see that there's a problem systematically in terms of what happens with the intensity, what I call hyper-individualism, where people somehow or another forget throughout society that we need to be working toward a common goal if we're going to have a really well-developed democratic society along with all the benefits of a market economy. So individualism run amok can essentially create this real intense set of self-interest. Now, what's the consequence of this? People don't have the ability or the interest necessarily to see each other's perspectives. There's so many people out there with so many different ideas. And I think that one of the things is that how do we exist, coexist in a system and thrive in systems that emphasize this so heavily? Now, what I would suggest to you is that there's an old saying that says all politics is local. So if you're a member of Congress that represents the geographic area in the Midwest that has hog farms and you go to the national legislature, you're going to represent those local interests nationally. From Southern California, you're going to represent the aerospace industry at the national level. Well, similarly, I think all perspective is local. I think that obviously it starts within us. And I think that if you think about all of us evolve, we become wise, we mature, we learn from profound moments in our life. So we all know that we learn important life's lessons. But I think what happens is the system tells us to leave a lot of that at home for the few people that are our loved ones and so forth. And I think that if we kind of change directions right now and think about what can we do, essentially, to make that, to change that? Well, I think that we look to those profound moments that change how we look at the world. For many people, it's the birth of a child and so forth. I think the human tragedy and the idea of someone passing away is that moment where you learn so much about what is so important in life. So I can talk about my father, who about 10 years ago passed away. And he passed away after an 8.5-month battle with cancer. And I think that, who was he, shall I say? He was a father, he was a husband, a small business owner, senior vice president at a major bank. He had a PhD in international relations. He taught international relations at the University of Southern California the last 10 years of his life. The last few years of his life, he was an activist and a humanitarian. He was a great, great man. When he passed away, or when he was diagnosed, I should say, obviously the family was very concerned. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was very advanced. So when I and my family realized this, we're realists. We understood that the odds were stacked against us. We essentially did whatever we could, alternative approaches along with the traditional approaches, whatever we could do to essentially help him fight for his life is what we wanted to do. And along that road, my perspective was altered, as anyone's would be in a moment like that, or moments, that he just didn't have it. He did not have that willpower to fight for himself the way he fought for other people in his life before he was diagnosed. It was just an incredible moment of realization and perspective that he just wasn't up for the fight. And it was, the odds were stacked against him, as I said. And I think my family and I knew this, but it didn't really sink in. One day, the last 29 days of his life, he was in the hospital, and I stayed every night with him for those 29 days and nights, specifically nights. And I remember kind of falling asleep with my face on the bed one day, and he was asleep, kind of bent over, and I felt his hand touch my head, and he asked me, "Am I exhausting you? Are you tired? Am I really just kind of doing you in?" And of course, I said no, I was exhausted, but it wasn't his fault. But it was really at that moment that I felt so bad that at that moment, a couple of weeks away from his death, he was so worried about us and what he was doing to us. And my perspective changed. My individual need of wanting him to live started to incorporate what his perspective was and what he needed. So it really was about the next day. I remember the sun coming up in the hospital, 5 in the morning, and he woke up, and I said, "Dad, we need to talk." And I said, "We can go down 2 paths. I can fight till the bitter end with you to find every possible solution to this disease, clinical trials, alternative approaches, whatever you want. Or we can turn around and stop that, and I can help prepare you emotionally, intellectually, in every way possible for your death." I said, "It's up to you." And he said, "That's what I want to do. I want to do the latter. I'm done, and I would really appreciate that." And so until the bitter end, the very bitter end, till his last breath, I was ambivalent. But my individual perspective brought into play his perspective, what he needed at that moment. And I think that was true for my entire family, that what can we do for him toward the end? And I remember my mother made a very great point at that time, which is when people pass away, if you know them and love them and they're close to you, your first instinct is, how is this going to affect me? right? That's the individualistic kind of approach. How is this going to affect me? And that is so true. When someone dies on the news that you don't know, you generally feel a sense of empathy for them in the abstract that they lost their life. But it's really that self-centeredness of, how can I go on without this person I love and need so much? So why am I telling you that? Because without even realizing it throughout the last 10 years, and then eventually I kind of became aware of it, was that I realized that in my everyday life, when I engaged in people and with people throughout all the systems that govern me, that I always, when I look at someone across the way, I say to myself, yes, they're an educational administrator, a faculty member, labor, management, Democrat, Republican, libertarian, right? Whatever they are. I understand they're all of that. But I still try to look at them and say, someone loves that person as much as I loved my father. And they love someone as much as he loved me and my entire family. And I try to inject that human element, not to be Pollyanna about it, not to be somehow or another idealistic. I think people should fight for their interests. But what I think should happen is that you reserve that dignity and that respect for people when you deal with them. It's almost a human right, that you reserve that dignity and respect for people so that even though you disagree, they feel respected. And what do I hope to achieve by that? One, that the process is just much more respectful and enjoyable, and that how we do things is as important as what we do. And two, by doing that and remembering that you hope that people lower their guard. They don't retreat to that defensive posture and stop listening to you. You hope that they realize that politics, they say, is about the art of compromise. Politics and getting along with people in life is also about focusing in on what you do have in common as opposed to what you don't. Because if you can work on what you do have in common in a very individualized society, you'll gain a greater perspective and appreciation for each other. And you hope you can pick that up when you in terms of taking that and running with it, and it will help you deal with the areas and the times when you do not agree with people. So when I go through life, I'm not perfect. It's a challenge to me. But when I leave the house and when I go throughout my professional life, my political life, my personal life with my family, sometimes I fail, but I always try to remember that's a human being that matters to somebody as much as my father mattered to me. And if we can take that with us out our front door, then I think, and use it in the systems that govern us, I think that we'll be able to find more common ground in our democracy. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.